Hi everyone, Kendall here, and welcome back this week for week 10 of our What's in Your Closet Sew Along, hosted by Pat Sloan at her website ilovetomakequilts.com. If you haven't done so already, jump over to Pat's website, download this week's free pattern, come back here, and I'll show you how I do it. Now, this is the time in the video where I normally say we start by having all the pieces cut out as per the pattern, but not this week. We need 8 half square triangles of each of our dark and medium fabrics, so I'm going to show you how I make them 8 at a time. And it's not just the way I make them, it's just the way you make them. So we start with, I've got an 8.5 inch square here. You can have an 8-inch square if you want no trim down. You can have an 8.25 square with a little bit of trim down, but I went for 8.5 just because I could. And what we need to do is take our background squares, which we should have 2 of, and we need to draw diagonal lines from corner to corner in both directions. So unlike the 2 at a time method, we're doing this in both directions. And what this actually does is we're just making 4 times the 2 at a time method at the same time. So, as I said, we've started with an 8.5 inch square, 2 of our background fabric and 1 each in our medium and dark fabric. We're drawing a line from corner to corner in both directions. We're going to take that to our machine and stitch 1/4 inch on each side of all of the drawn lines. Now that we have indeed stitched 1/4 inch on each side of both of our drawn lines, as you know, I like to give these a press first to settle those seams down and to sink the stitches into the fabric before getting ready to cut these down. Now we start by cutting these in half, both horizontally and vertically, and because I started with an 8.5 inch square, I'm just lining up my 4.25 inch mark there on the left hand side to do my vertical cut. Then, without moving the fabric, just your ruler, we're going to do the same from the bottom, measuring up that 4.25 inches and slicing it across. We can then cut them in half on our drawn lines. If you started by doing the cutting on your diagonal lines, it may be a little bit harder to then do the vertical and the horizontal chopping. So I start with those because we know the size of our square. And then if things get separated, we have those drawn lines as a reference to do the rest of our cutting. Once we've done this, we'll press everything towards the dark side, and then we'll get ready to trim these down. Scratch what I said before, we don't press all of these to the dark side at all. I've separated my piles into 2 lots of 8, so 8 of each colour, and then in each colour 4 that we will press towards the dark side and 4 that we will press towards the light side. And what this will enable is in future steps we will have seams that nest. So we're planning ahead at the pressing stage, so we will press 4 medium to the dark, which makes no sense because then we'll also press 4 dark to the dark, and then we'll press 4 of each also to the background fabric. We now need to trim all of our half square triangles down, and the trim down measurement is 3.5 inches. So you'll see here that I still have my little makeshift block lock where I put 3 layers of painter's tape along the diagonal of my little 3.5 inch square ruler here, and what that painter's tape edge does is it will butt up against the seam of our squares. And you'll notice that I've also pulled out my rotating mat. Because we do need these to be 3.5, I can line that up, trim my 2 sides without moving the ruler or the block, rotate that all around and trim the final 2 sides. In many of my other videos, I show you various ways that I do trim down my half square triangles. But in this instance today, because I still had the painter's tape on this little ruler and it was the exact size that we needed for the trim down, I went with this. So trim all of your half square triangles down using your preferred method to 3.5 inches. The eagle-eyed among you may notice that I am keeping the 2 separate stacks of the ones that were pressed to the background fabric and the main fabric, and that's because after we've got all these trimmed down, we are actually going to sew these together in pairs. So by having the triangles that have the opposing directions already, we're ready to just sew those together with those opposing seams so that everything nests nicely. I'm just showing you again here how I do an alternate method of my trimming down, which is using 2 at a time, and that's by making sure that your half square triangle units are nice and snugly nested along those seam lines, and then lining the diagonal of your ruler on that stitching line, making sure you have enough fabric outside your required trim down measurement, and trimming the first 2 sides. You then rotate the block and once again place that diagonal line from your ruler on the stitching line, and this time we can put our 3.5 inch measurement on those freshly cut sides and trim the final 2 sides. These are now already in their pairs, ready to take to the machine and sew. Because we had the way that we opposed our seam lines, cutting these in the stacks of 2 puts them already together, ready to just run through the machine, thus saving time. You can also do the 2 at a time trim down method using that makeshift block lock ruler, and I'm not sure if I show that in this footage, but I have in a previous video. The tape edge on the ruler still just butts up against that seam line, and you are able to trim them 2 at a time. Now, as I said before, we have all of these pairs ready to just take to the machine and stitch through. Because we have the opposing seam directions and we match them up, we are able to just stitch these through. And so our pairs of our medium fabric with our dark fabric, because we cut them all separately using our makeshift block lock, we will just need to match those up and feed them through the machine and stitch our 1/4 inch seam allowance. With all of our pairs sewn, we'll just clip them all apart here, and I like in this instance to press all of these seams open. We now need to take 2 of our dark pairs that we have and 2 of our medium pairs that we have, and sew those together to form a square and a square block. Now, because of all of our pressing and everything before, we can actually get every single one of these intersections to nest and interlock, so that when we go and take them to the machine and stitch our 1/4 inch, everything will line up perfectly. With those seams now sewn, we will also press this seam open, and then we'll get ready to sew a flying geese unit on the top and the bottom of each of these in the opposing colours. As I said before, now we just need to attach these flying geese units to the top and the bottom of our square here and line up the best we can our open seams there, making sure that when we stitch these on with our 1/4 inch, that we don't lose the point of our square. That just means that once you take it over to the machine, just pay special attention when you're going across that seam that your thread on your machine is just to the top of that peak, and then when you press that open, you won't miss a point. With those flying geese units now attached on either side of our central square, we need to press these, but you know me, I plan ahead, and I know that to get these seams to nest and for all our points to be perfect and everything, we need to press these in opposite directions. We could press both of these seams open, but I elected to press one set up towards the flying geese unit, and you do have a little bit of trouble on the ends there for the ends of your half square triangles where you can see I'm just fiddling. But it eventually sits down nicely. With enough heat added to the fabric, you can move it in whichever direction you like. For this one, I would normally have clipped into the seam allowance on either side of our peak from the square because we are wanting to press towards the center on this one, but we only need it to be towards the center on either end where we're going to be doing our next seam. Now, I do this in this instance without clipping into the seam, and it just leaves it a bit wonky on the back, which you'll see when I flip this over. But I would suggest clipping into, but not past the stitching on either side of that peak from the square. So therefore, you can still press that up towards the flying geese unit while getting the legs of the flying geese to press inwards. We do this so that we can have, as I said, all of our seams nesting when we come to sew our final seam here. And I'm sorry that I didn't do it in this instance. Grunge is such a soft fabric that with the heat you can just move it around. And you can see there what I mean by the different directions of the seam. Now if we had have cut into that, they'd be sitting really nicely. But we're now just going to nest all of our seams along here. Including that central one, making sure we match up our point, and when we're stitching our seam on this, we'll make sure that we go just to the top of that little peak so that we don't lose either of those points in the center of our block. Once this is done, I think I press it open, but let's wait and see. Our final seam for this week's block has been sewn, and as such all we need to do is press this, and now you see I'm clipping in to get this nice and flat. Amazing. I didn't think that I did that, but obviously I did. So that gets that nice and flat with all of our seams going in the right direction. And my prediction before anyone would think that I'd already looked at this was correct, and I am pressing this final seam open, and our block for this week is done. How fantastic and simple was this week's block. I have made it in other variations using a square and a square and some flying geese instead of the half square triangles, but those alternate methods do lead to a little bit of waste. Pat drafts them with half square triangles to keep the patterns basic and as least waste as possible. So how good's that? Alrighty folks, as always, I'll see you all again real soon. Bye for now.